Ernie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
So let's kick this off as we always do by having you introduce yourself to our listeners. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Ernie Button. I am a resident of Phoenix, Arizona. Have been here in the desert Southwest for about 45 years now. We're getting to the very hot season, so this is the last bit of good weather that we're going to have before it's consistently 105 to 110. Um, My day job is I'm a speech pathologist at a uh, local hospital. But I have been a photographer for pretty much my entire life. I didn't know that there was this big world of exhibitions, of museums, of really showing and sharing my work until my wife went to grad school for fine art painting. And since that time, I've just been not obsessed, but really driven to develop bodies of work, portfolios, and share them with the public.
That's brilliant. One thing you may not know is that I also have a fine arts degree.
Oh,
Mine
nice.
is in poetry.
Okay.
So it was one of those things where I got it and then immediately entered the workforce as somehow worse qualified than I would have been if I had just come out of undergrad. But the consequence of me having that arts degree is that I resonate with your work in a number of ways. And I'm excited to dig into those ways as we get into the
Sure.
conversation here. But I'm going to drop three terms with you right now. The first of which
Okay.
is a throwaway. The first term is whiskey, right?
Yep.
You and I both know that we're passionate about whiskey. The other two terms may be useful as we get into our conversation here. The second one is particles.
Okay.
And if you look at some of your photography, particles are an important aspect of the way that you visually present this. And the other term I'm going to drop here that may be the least obviously relevant right now, but maybe as we get further in our conversation will become more of a topic that we interact with is something called emergence, which
Okay.
my definition of emergence is what happens when a group of particles begin to interact and then create some sort of phenomenon that is visual or perceptible to us
Hmm.
that is greater than the sum of those individual particles acting together. And when I first encountered your work in this book, The Art of Whisky, that we'll be discussing here in this interview, particles and emergence were the two singular things on my mind as I was looking at this gorgeous photography. So I figured I'd just throw those terms out there as a way for
Sure.
us to kind of enter this conversation. And then I would just leave it to you to tell our listeners how the worlds of whiskey and photography collided for you.
Um, the obviously all three of those words are fabulous descriptors for my current work, and the the third term was really, which we'll get to, was describing the science and the interaction of how this process starts to develop. But as I mentioned at the start, I've been a lifelong photographer as a kid. I remember saving for my first film camera that I went in jointly with my brother. It was a Canon AE1. And, it's always been an interest and a hobby of mine. But as I became a working adult, it really started to become a respite, a place where I could explore my thoughts, my ideas, my humor, all of that through different bodies of work and different portfolios. Um, how the photography and this current body of work, Vanishing Spirits, intersected. Um, we had or have a painter friend of ours that collected rocks and agates. Those are slices of rock with moss and inclusions in them, so that if you look at them and take away all the extraneous stuff on the outside, there are many landscapes in there. Oftentimes suggestive of landscapes, sometimes very directly representing landscapes. she had always wanted to do a photography project with those. And so, because we were friends, I said, sure, well, I'll go ahead and give it a try. And, through that process of learning how to light these small objects and these small rocks, I figured out very quickly how to light what I was seeing in this whiskey phenomenon. So, when I first saw this whiskey phenomenon, it was after having a dram with my wife, and the glasses were left out on the table overnight, and they dried as I've learned how they dry and how quickly they dry. And when I woke up in the morning to take the glass to the dishwasher, I noticed this fine residue in the bottom of the glass. And when I held it up to the light, there was these really intricate fine lines in the bottom that I'm like, I had just finished this project. So I'm like, oh, light bulb immediately went off and it said, I know how to light this. I know how to try and bring out what is naturally happening. And back then I was working on film. I had a medium format camera, which is a beast of a camera, but it gave you beautiful, transparencies. Um, and so I had to wait for like a week or two for the film to get back. And when I saw the results, I'm like, there's something there, something that I want to continue to explore. And that's really the genesis of this project, roughly 15 years ago now, that, just something that was naturally occurring, that I had the skill set to be able to pursue. Um, it really just kind of blossomed from that one singular aha moment.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to do right now is slow myself down because I want to go down every single rabbit hole that you just mentioned and just completely alienate our listener base by asking questions that are way more specific than we need to get into. So what
Yeah,
I'm going to do, I'm going
it's
to
okay
slow
to be
my own roll.
geeky.
We'll get there. I promise. I want to get there on like maybe a 45-degree slope instead of
Sure.
like an 89-degree slope.
Yeah,
So I'm going to ask you how you got into whiskey, and you kind of generally said that your wife and
yep,
you had been interested in Scotch whiskey. I've listened to your story on another podcast, the Whiskey
yeah,
Cast, that I listened to. I'm wondering if you might even back up slightly further than that and just
sure.
explain what attracts you to whiskey in the first place, both from a flavor standpoint and from a process standpoint. Maybe starting with flavor and then getting into process, because I know that in the course of this project that you've undertaken, you've done a lot of travel to Scotland as well.
Yes.
So can you just walk us through the whiskey side of things?
Absolutely. Really, the genesis of this project is as a result of my wife's father, so my father in law. He was a big Scotch whiskey drinker. And one of the big splurges back then for him was like a Glenlivet 12. And so, he shared some with my wife early on, before we were married, and really expected her to hate it, and she really enjoyed it. And so it really became a bonding element for my wife and her dad, and to this day they enjoy a dram like nobody else. And so, me marrying into the family, I had to step up my game and really appreciate a Scotch whiskey. And so, you asked, specifically what do I enjoy about the flavor profile? Um, it really is, for me now, it's very difficult to separate the journeys that we've taken to Scotland and knowing the smells of a distillery and the smells of the barley, um, and just being able to smell that, in the glass. The glass really, when you smell that, you're immediately transported to back in Scotland. If you've ever taken a distillery tour, you know the smells and you know the process and you know the hard work and the time that goes into this little thing that you're enjoying. So for me, it's very difficult to separate those things out. I enjoy being able to taste that barley, to be able to for me, it's a little more challenging to be able to separate out those tastes that they describe, and so it's definitely a challenge for me to be able to taste that pineapple taste on the back end, or so things like that.
One of the ways that I often describe the process of tasting a whiskey and kind of interacting with that challenge that you just described
Sure.
is as if you're tracking an animal.
Yep.
And I'm sure that resonates with you because you've gone to the places, right? So places is a part of it.
Yeah.
And especially when you get more intimate with the process of
Hmm.
creating these whiskeys, you start to be able to tie certain things that you taste in the glass with certain processes that these distillers and these blenders and
Yeah.
the people who are down there also kind of engaging with these finishes, right? Whether it's a cask finish or whether they're blending, certain sort of ex bourbon casks, these steps that they're engaging with all the way from malting through fermentation, distillation, straight through the aging and blending process, you can start to trace these things into the flavors that you're getting. And so doubtless that's the same thing that you're kind of describing as you get this on the palate. And I'm wondering if you might take us through what this looks like in the glass, because if every whiskey that you put into a glass
Yeah.
dried the same way and had the same effects on that surface that you are then going into photograph,
Hmm.
then you wouldn't have the diverse collection of art that you have. But it seems like what you're doing is you're capturing different phenomena within a single category, being what we might call grain, where malt whiskey in general. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about
Sure.
both the process of the vanishing of that spirit in the bottom of the glass and also the forces that you think are responsible for these
Yeah.
different fingerprints as I've described them in the past?
Sure. Yeah. There's lots of thoughts going through my mind, trying to condense this so that it's just not one 30-minute answer. Um, so, to create this phenomenon, you need a spirit with high ABV, so high alcohol by volume. So, whiskey is a perfect example of that. Um, you need a flat bottom glass. So a Glencairn won't work because when it's dry with a Glencairn, it's drying into this small little divot. Whereas with the like a rocks glass or a tumbler, it's a flat bottom that can spread out, and it will dry a lot faster that way as the alcohol is spreading out. Now, one of the things to remember is that it doesn't take a lot of alcohol or a lot of whiskey to be able to create this phenomenon. I've described it where if you drain the cup, and get that last drop in your mouth, there's still enough residue in the glass left over to be able to create this phenomenon. So, for people that are worried about wasting whiskey for this process, you can create it on your own by just enjoying that last drop of the dram, and there's still going to be an image left for you. I always like to refer to it as drinks in a show because you're getting that exhibition after you've enjoyed the dram. And so it really is just the dregs, the residue of the whiskey that's creating this. Um, so yeah, that's really the heart of it.
Let me try and share my screen here,
Okay.
and I've got some. Yeah, let me see. I haven't done this before on this program. All right. I've got my screen coming up here, and I'm hopefully going to be pulling up some photos that you have shared with us. If
Okay.
this doesn't work, then what I'll do is I'll refer our listeners to our Instagram page where I've shared a number of the images that you've created. Okay, let's go to. I'm not quite sure if this is looking. Is this just looking
There we
insane
go.
to you right now?
Well, there was that vanishing, replicating what we're seeing on the right side, and then it's getting smaller and smaller. But for
I
just a
see.
brief second, I did see that image of Abelauer.
Is this reasonable?
There it is. Yeah, I can see
Okay.
it.
Okay. So I'm going to bring us to a different one. I think we
Okay.
maybe can come back to this one, but
Sure, sure.
maybe let's look at this one. The Arbed,
Yep.
the Ardbeg Ugadal,
Yep.
the Oogie as they call it. Is this a good example that we can use as a case study for what you're describing?
No, that is absolutely perfect. Oftentimes, the Isla whiskeys are a bit more challenging to get a pattern or a refined pattern out of because of the peat, because that extra element um, makes the lines a little bit more fuzzy, not as clear. I'm able to finesse it, obviously, because I was able to get a really fine pattern out of this. Um, and this is a good time to explain a little bit more of the process.
Yeah.
I've accumulated over the 15 years various glasses that I know will do different things in the drying process.
Mm,
So if one is, a bit too concave where it's collecting a little bit too much, I know what that's going to produce for me and which particular whiskey I should use in that. Whereas, something like an Isla, I want it more flat so that there will be a bit more separation in the pattern. Um, and I know which whiskeys, which regions are going to give me better images. So that's been interesting to learn over the years. But this particular image created a wonderful pattern for me, and oftentimes, to add some artistic effect, I'll add different color lights and different color gels. That's me adding the color. But with this one, this just shows how the light is being refracted into that rainbow pattern. That's just a single light source, and as it's moving through the particles, it's being divided into the different colors in the spectrum. So I found this one fascinating just because, you know, it was my first indication that these particles are really not quite acting like a prism, but, giving me a different density. So it's giving me different light colors.
it also, a couple of the other things that I see from this image, and for anybody who's listening to us on the podcast, I again check out the YouTube video, check out our Instagram. This image is also featured there. But in the center, we have almost like a rosette or a rose, where like you've got this sort of densely packed, and then also spreading kind of fractal of like almost crepey concentric lines. And then as you get out toward the edges of this image, you get more color as you just described the sort of refractive pattern of the light that you're passing through this. But you also get what looks to me to be almost like a fusion of electricity and sediment, right? Like there's
Yeah.
sort of a crispy nature to these lines, but there's also a sedimentary nature to them. And the reason why I mentioned that is because I was hoping that you could go as far as you're willing to go into the way that the drying and the surface tension of these spirits yields the outcome that I'm currently sharing on my screen. Does that make any sense?
It does. So when I'm drying these patterns and I'm watching them dry, it's a little bit faster than paint drying. Um, they dry from out to in. So if we're getting a good consolidation in that center, kind of the finale or the fury of the image, that's where its last drying um, finale. Everything is drying from out to in. So there's oftentimes a little bit more in the center. And so that's the last part that dries. So if you think about whiskey, it's made up of three elements. You got the water, you got the grain, which for Scotch whiskey, it's a barley, and then it's the yeast. So those three ingredients are not going to produce these patterns. What is really the secret sauce is those three it, elements through the new make spirit resting in the cask. And so that is what is creating, that's the magic ingredient that really creates this phenomenon. It's the organic material that is infused into the new make and is drawn out by the new make from the barrels to create these patterns. It's a pretty awesome, wondrous, natural phenomenon that, as I was going around Scotland over the years and talking with different distillers, they've oftentimes seen this phenomenon. They're like, "Oh yeah, I've seen that." But I found it so interesting, and with my photography background, I was able to bring kind of a uniqueness to it. So really, it's the aging in the cask, the cask, that gives it that information to be able to create these patterns. I have experimented with, moonshine or early on in the project, I picked up a bottle of the Jim Beam Ghost, which is non-aged, and there was nothing. So I'm like, okay, there's got to be something to do with that wood interaction. And I don't know if you had the chance to read that research paper that was published.
I didn't read
2000.
the research paper. I read the summary in the
Okay,
book that you included. And since we're here on video, I figure I'll hold up my copy here.
nice.
It's probably going to be superimposed on the
Yeah.
screen here, but it's the introduction was really informative in terms of the interdisciplinary way that you engaged in this experimentation. So maybe since you're mentioning that research paper, can you talk about how you were able to collaborate with some university professors and scientists? Because pestering professors is also something that
Yeah.
I am also very fond of. So feel free to comment on that as well.
No, I'm a man of questions, and so after a couple years of experimenting with this process, I'm like, okay, why is this happening? So of course I went to Google and I was trying to research on my own. And about the time I was asking those questions, Dr. Peter Juncker put out a paper talking about the coffee ring effect. Why you get that coffee ring effect. If you spill a little coffee and it's under your mug. And so I reached out to him, and he's like, "Yeah, it's interesting what you're seeing, but my paper won't answer that." And so the conversation kind of stopped there. And so I'm like, "Okay, let me, go to Google again." And I typed in I think I typed in Harvard, I typed in fluid dynamics, and I typed in whiskey, and not knowing what I would get. And like the second or third entry was this guy by the name of Dr. Howard Stone, because he had worked at Harvard and then he had moved to Princeton. So I tracked down an email and just on the off chance that he might respond to an email, I said, "Hey, I'm seeing this phenomenon. Would you be able to explain what's going on?" And I expected him to say, "No, I can't and I don't have time." One of the nicest guys on the planet. Truly, he was like, "This is really interesting. Here's a paper that I did a decade or two ago that might explain something about it, but I've never really seen this phenomenon." And so we developed a correspondence over email. And, the more that he thought about it, the more that he investigated, the more he's like, "Oh, well, we should get some of our PhD students on this and see if anybody's interested." Because he's the director of the complex fluids group over at Princeton. It's a very fancy title, and I like it. Um,
Me too.
and so the way that it works there is they've got tons of PhD candidates that, if they're interested in an idea, they get to pursue that, and they get to write up a paper, and he's going to help them with that, and they get to pursue publishing it. And so he found a few students that were interested in picking up this idea and running with it. Lo and behold, a couple years later, they had a finished product, and we got it published in 2016 in physical review letters, PRL. which is a proper physics journal. So yeah, pretty amazing that they included me as a co-author on the paper because I brought them this idea and I'd done so much of my end of the research that they're like, you should be on the paper.
That's awesome. Well,
It truly
there
is.
there's one thing that grad students will always be a fan of, and that is the excuse to work with distilled spirits and imbibe them. And the thing that I can see the authors and the people who are reviewing these peer-reviewed papers would be interested in is anything that's more interesting than what they're currently working with, the titles that they're currently working with. So if you can stick a whiskey or a distilled spirit in there, I think that really ups your odds
Sure.
of getting the attention of the Academy because, oh man, I've been a part of the Academy and it's not always as interesting as it seems. So where do we go from here? I think that we have a good sense of how you are coming to the intersection of photography and spirits. We've
Hmm.
got the basics down in terms of how this phenomenon occurs, right? You basically leave a couple drops of whiskey in the bottom of a glass, it dries, and it creates some sort of sedimentary evaporative pattern unique to it, right? So this is
Yes.
how you are able to capture the unique fingerprint of this vanishing spirit. How about you take us through the ways that you have chosen to stylize and portray these? Because what we've been discussing so far is mostly a physical phenomenon. And
Hmm.
what you're doing is you're taking that physical phenomenon and you're transforming it based on what you're seeing. And it's part self expression. And it's also partially you listening to what's already there on the canvas, if that makes any sense. So, can you talk about that tension and then the ways that you use, especially color, to manipulate
Yeah.
these creations and draw out the landscapes? So, I think landscape is a good way to also think about these things because you have an entire series based on like planets. So,
Yes.
why don't you take that and run?
Yeah, the project has definitely evolved over the years because me as a person, you evolve over 15 years of working on something. And so when I was first getting into this process, I was really just fascinated with the lines, the fact that I could repeat this over and over again, and it would give me slightly different results, based on all the different elements, how quickly it was drying, the type of glass that I was using, the type of whiskey that I was using. It was all interesting and new to me. And so really I wanted to capture the feeling of what I was experiencing by seeing these. And so absolutely I was using different colored lights to be able to bring out the highlights in the patterns, to to elevate a particular section of the glass so that this particular rhythm or pattern was more interesting than this pattern. And so that's what it was all about in the first several years, is really trying to gain my footing of how can I make this interesting to me and ultimately the people looking at these prints or these images. um, I started to experiment with cropping them into circles, um, primarily because, well, two reasons. When we drink from a glass, it's typically a circle. And so if you were, looking at the possibility that someone might see this in the bottom of their glass, that's why I was cropping it into a circle, because that interplay of the viewer saying, "Hey, I could potentially see this in the bottom of my glass," because that's how I first discovered it. And from a practical standpoint, oftentimes if I'm cropping it into a circle, and this is a little peek behind the curtains, is that if I'm cropping it into a circle, oftentimes there's nothing interesting beyond that. It kind of diffuses, or it doesn't make those fantastic lines, or it's just not enough information to highlight. And so I'm really highlighting that circle section. So that's how the circle evolved, because initially everything was a square. I was just cropping it into squares. Um, because it made a fine looking print, if it's a square. But evolving into the circle was that next step. Um, Several years more, I noticed that a lot of the images that I was taking and found fascinating had this NASA Hubble telescope celestial feel to them. So I'm like, number one, if I'm going to leave it as a landscape, I want to highlight what's giving that galaxy feeling. Um, then I became obsessed with, okay, looking at the NASA website and the Instagram page. Um, Lots of planets, lots of pictures of planets. And I'm like, these kind of have a planetary feel. So, how can I shape this into a sphere so that it looks more planetary without losing the integrity of all the patterns are coming from the whiskey itself? I'm okay at Photoshop. I use it to color correct, I use it to spot, dust particles. Living here in Arizona, there's lots of dust in the air. So, to dry these, you can't cover them. You have to leave it exposed to the air. So there's going to be some dust that gets in there. Um, I'm using Photoshop to really just make the image pop. I'm not replicating lines. I'm not, taking parts and duplicating it. But with the Planet series, I started to distort them into more of a sphere, and I really studied how they're shaded, how they look, as another planet is coming across them, or if it's in an eclipse. What is that sensation looking like? And so that took quite a few years to be able to figure out exactly that. That's one of the perfect representations. Is I wanted it to feel more like a planet, more than just something that was turned into a bubble. And
Right. And
so that
just for people listening in, what we've got featured right now is the Planet Macallan. Do you know what Macallan iteration this was?
what
It
the
says number 101.
oh the 3-digit number is more of a cataloging for me because I
Hmm.
was making so many images. I had to give them different numbers.
Sure.
But with the Macallan, I was typically using either a fine oak 12 or
Mhm.
a sherry cask 12. I think they've done away with the fine oak series, but yeah, it was typically one of the 12s that I was using.
So yeah, sorry for interrupting. I
That's
just wanted
okay.
to introduce what we had on the screen here, just sort of like as an exemplar of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so, I really started to gravitate. Some just had that planetary feeling. And there are some that I will try out and try that spherical look. And it's like, it just doesn't look good. So I'm going to leave it as a flat image. And some just lended themselves to that spherical look.
So one of the things that I learned in doing a little bit of research for this interview is, I mean, you've already mentioned the fact that you feel that the barrel aging of the spirit is what really accounts for a lot of the lines and striations and color,
Hmm.
sort of refractive patterns that you've mentioned thus far. But one thing that you also noted is that grain based distillates seem to operate differently than perhaps a grape distillate or a cane distillate. I don't know if you've done much work in the agave space, but perhaps from an agave distillate. So, have you noticed anything pertaining to the distillate base playing into how a spirit dries as opposed to the barrel aging medium? Now, I imagine that it's probably a much more sensitive thing to try to perceive because it seems like what you're saying is those barrel aging influences are so much heavier from a visual perspective than the distillate base influences. But nonetheless, have you noticed anything as a consequence of the distillate bases?
No, I appreciate you bringing that up because that's been kind of the next phase of this project. Um, when I started, there weren't a lot of barrel aged products out there. Whiskey was pretty much it. There were some that if you knew your spirits, you'd be able to get your hands on. Like, I didn't know that there was a barrel aged gin category, but because whiskey has become so popular over the past couple decades, now there's an offshoot of anything that's barrel aged. So there's many more options of barrel aged gin. Absolute Vodka back in 2016 came out with Oak by Absolute. So everybody was trying something barrel aged.
Yeah.
And so that kind of rekindled my original thesis of, okay, when you pursue a tequila, or you pursue a rum, or you pursue something that's not barrel aged, what happens if you start to look at it from a barrel aged perspective? And the results have been surprising, because I'm getting some different patterns from these spirits that are barrel aged. So I mentioned the Oak by Absolute. That produced some interesting patterns. Not as dense, not as clear as the whiskey, of course, but it was producing something similar. And then Añejo tequila, that produces some interesting patterns. I got my hands on some Partida Añejo, some really nice patterns. Rum always gave me a hint of a pattern, but I tried some Ron Zacapa,
Mm-hmm.
and that gave me kind of a fluid gas-like pattern, which was really interesting. I think I posted one of those on my Instagram, and I turned that into a planet because it was this. What it looked like a flame, it looked like a flower, and it was not the consistent repetitive pattern that whiskey would do. So obviously there was some barrel influence there. Anything that is grape based will not produce a pattern, which was a little disappointing. So, like a cognac and a brandy, nothing.
It's so sad, because grape-based distillates and fruit distillates of all sorts are actually one of my greatest passions. So it's kind of
No,
sad to
absolutely.
hear that. But
Yeah.
I I'm interested in the general phenomenon that you're pointing out here, because I mean, as you've already referenced, this has been a project of over a decade, like a
Yeah.
decade and a half long project for you. And what warms my heart about this conversation is the fact that, like, usually when somebody comes out with a book, especially in the art world, they're like, all right, here's my stuff,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go do something else now. And you've got this remarkable collection. You've got the unifying factor being
Mhm.
Scotch whiskey, but you're also just steeped in this world of so many different types of spirits that you can pass through this same type of process, and you still have a lot of ground to cover in terms of what can be done with it. I want to reference probably my favorite part of the conversation that you had with the guys from the Whiskey Cast.
Yeah.
And you said something, and I'm quoting you here, so you said it. So you can go ahead and you can reverse it
Sure.
right now if you
Sure.
want. But you said that you are against chemical analysis in terms of, like, perhaps putting this stuff through like a mass spectrometer or something, because it breaks the mystery of what's happening. And yet you're still interested in learning what's happening, right? And I
Yeah.
love that, because it is truly the art speaking, right?
Yeah.
Like, the artist is trying to translate the universal through the particular and vice versa. So you've got this particular spirit here, whether it's the Macallan, whether it's the Ardbeg Ugadal, you're taking this particular spirit and you're trying to pass this through your lighting and your camera rig in a way that somehow communicates something to the viewers, an aspect of the universal experience of it, a
Mhm.
whiskey.
Yeah.
And so I love this tension of being like, I don't really want to I don't want to know what every particle is doing in this. I don't want to necessarily know all the math behind it. And yet I'm still curious about the trends of what's going on. Can you talk about that tension of
Sure. Sure.
wanting to know, but also not wanting to break the magic?
Art whiskey is an art as much as it is a science. When you have, I've had the pleasure of meeting both David Stewart and Brian Kinsman, and what they do in such a gut feeling flash of a moment. It's an art. It's not something that you can learn the science of it, but when they're smelling a sample and they're making that quick judgment, that's an art. That's something that is, it can sort of be taught, but it can't, because you either have it or you don't. And so from an art perspective, it's the exploration that excites me. It's the really trying to figure out almost on my own what's being created, what this particular whiskey will do for me. And in the process, I'm getting better at making images. And that's what we all want to do, is get better at our craft. I want to get better as a photographer, as an image maker. I'm sure the people in the whiskey industry are wanting to get better at what they're doing, putting out a superior project than it was 10 years ago. And so that's my reluctance to really do a chemical analysis, because that would be simple. Take all my samples, have them analyzed. It's like, okay, here's the data, and it's like that would answer certain questions for me. But would I be as excited about exploring if I'm just like, okay, there's the answer. I know what this one's going to do. So there is an element of mystery. What is it going to reveal to me? That excites me about these projects, and excites me about exploring something like Japanese whiskey, which was a huge surprise to me. Knowing that the different grains, rice versus barley, is going to give me something completely different. So, I mean, I think if I had the answer, I might have been less enthused about exploring something like rice whiskey. So, you always hate to say never, because who knows? I might break down and say, I got to know. I got to know what's in this versus this. But I think it would remove a lot of the mystery. Just like, if you're told how something is created, like on a movie, if you know that it's all props and sets and special effects, it's like, oh, you lose that sense of wonder, that sense of mystery. And life is tough, life is hard, and it's nice to have a little bit of wonder and a little bit of mystery in what you do. So
Uh,
all
yeah.
that to say, yeah, I said that and I mean it.
Well, really, really eloquently stated. It reminds me of something that a past guest stated on our podcast, Mark Forsyth,
Okay.
who is the author of a short history of drunkenness. And he said that humans can't take much of reality. And that's, one of the reasons why we drink. And so,
Sure.
to get in there and it's almost, if you're looking at this from a physics perspective, it's almost like there's this temptation to become Laplace's demon, to
Hmm.
become this entity who knows the physical, mathematical, perfect result of every state of every physical system in existence, because then you'd be able to predict everything and you'd be all knowing, functionally omniscient.
Which would
And
be a
yet,
little bit boring.
yeah, it really does seem that way. And another way to go at this would be to say there have been music artists who have used big data to calculate
Hmm.
how all these top 10 Billboard hits have gone. And that gave us Nickelback. And I don't think anybody here is really celebrating the fact that Nickelback is, God's gift to the world, right? So the third thing I'll bring into this is a quote. I don't remember who it's attributed to, but it's always stuck with me, is that there is no great beauty that hath not some strangeness in proportion.
Sure.
And I think that when I see your work, one of the things that I see you pulling out from all these whiskey fingerprints, whether it's in the shape of a planet or a nebula, or it's more of like you zoom in even further on the macro and you get almost these like magma like
Hmm.
perspectives, is that you're showing the strangeness in proportion and the wonder that is sort of the result of what the blenders and the distillers are responsible for. Like
Yeah.
you're really showcasing that uniqueness. And I think to me, like, going back to this notion of emergence wouldn't be emergence if we got the same thing every time.
Mhm.
Emergence is interesting in terms of the interactions of large groups of particles because of the new stuff, the unexpected stuff, the
Sure.
novelties that we get. And that's, I think, what drew me so strongly to your work and why I'm excited for you that you have so many other spirits categories and so much more to let dry on the bottom of glass and pass through some light filters and
Yeah.
see what you can create. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. And, you know, I like the fact that this project works on so many different levels. It works on a science level, it works on a passion level, it works on the viewer looking at the image and going, what is this? I've never seen this planet, or I've never seen this landscape. And that's beautiful to me. The fact that, people's minds and perspectives will help dictate what they're seeing and what they're viewing. And that's ultimately the beauty of art, is that we all bring our own perspectives and our viewpoints to art. And you may see what I'm seeing, you may not see even close to what I'm seeing, but that's the beauty of art. Um, I love that there's this whole industry that are working passionately on their craft for something that we enjoy in a very transient moment. It's really mind blowing to think that we're storing away these casks for 15, 18, 21 years. Years, and then I'm going to drink it, for just an evening. Um, it's amazing the dedication that these people all over the world, but I have a lot of experience with meeting these people in Scotland, and just the dedication to their craft is wonderful to observe.
Yeah. Well, Ernie, I want to jump into a couple of quick lightning round
Oh,
questions here,
sure,
but
sure.
first I wanted to just give you the opportunity to promote the book. And so like if
Yeah.
our listeners or our viewers who've been joining us here are interested in picking up The Art of Whiskey, where can they go? Who's the publisher? How do they get their hands on a copy, especially knowing that Father's Day is coming up? And from what I hear, dads like to drink.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed that the book came out after Mother's Day,
Yeah.
because it would be a perfect opportunity for mothers to pick it up as well.
Hmm.
I find it ironic that my wife is the one that introduced me to whiskey. So whiskey is something that should be celebrated from all people, all genders. But you're absolutely right; it's available for Father's Day. It was published by Chronicle Books, and it was a very interesting process trying to publish a book during the pandemic, because I'm sure the process would have been a lot faster, but it took roughly 2.5 years to get this from concept to people's hands.
Yeah.
It's available from Chronicle. I think there's a 20% discount on their particular website. It's also available through Amazon. For my friends outside of the US, Amazon is probably the best place to pick that up.
Sure. And what we'll do is I'll collect a number of different ways to purchase this book, and we'll put those over on the show notes page over at modernbarcart.com/podcast.
Awesome.
And the last thing I wanted to ask
Yeah.
is, it seems like this project is ongoing. Is there anything sort of on the horizon for you, or maybe already sort of stationed in your studio? Is there already a spirit drying in a glass that you're super excited about, or is there a category that you're most excited to dig into as we kind of move forward here in 2022?
There's definitely some projects that I have that are either in the talks or close to solidifying. I'm still fascinated by this rice whiskey phenomenon. the organic patterns that it makes for me. At the very beginning of the pandemic, a company, a new whiskey company by the name of Shibui, reached out to me, and they had talked about doing a project with me, and nothing has really come to fruition with that. But they provided me with their entire line of whiskey samples, and the images and the patterns that I've gotten from those are so unique. Um, that I would love to be able to share them with the public, but I haven't shared them all because I have no idea if a project is going to come out of this or not.
Yeah,
Um,
shout out to my friend Nicholas Polacki from Shibui.
yeah, super
He
nice
was on
guy.
the podcast, and they just a remarkable lineup, and they're really
Yes.
doing things in good faith, with the projects that they're doing. Because I know a lot of those guys, they have experience in other regions and kind of taking their talents to Japan as kind of, freelance mercenaries. But the way that they've gone about it, and the partnerships that they've made there, especially with their like 100% rice whiskeys and stuff like that, is just absolutely stunning. Really done in good faith, and
No,
really well.
absolutely. And like I said, it's a very good whiskey, but the patterns are so different than the
Mm-hmm.
Scotch. Like I said, I hope to be able to share those. If nothing comes of a partnership, then I will definitely end up sharing, what I have. But truly fascinating to me. And
Awesome.
also, Waterford has become a really big popular whiskey, and I really admired what they were trying to do as far as prove that terroir is a thing, and can different farm regions make a difference in the taste. And so I'm like, I reached out to them. I think it was 2019. Yeah, it was. They had started the conversation, and we were all set to visit Waterford and pick up some samples. And we were doing that April 2020. And so, of course, that's when the pandemic really just
Yeah.
kind of took off.
Yeah.
And so that was stalled. All that to say, 2 years later, I finally got some samples, and I've been furiously making images with that, really trying to see what their whiskey and some of their casks will produce. Initially, some interesting results. So, again, hope to be able to share that on the horizon.
That's awesome. Well, I can't recommend to our listeners enough to, subscribe to you on your social media and keep an eye on what you're putting out. I also just love the fact that you're just evaporating whiskey. Like, what you do
Yeah,
is you just let whiskey evaporate.
yeah.
Like, there's something just delicious about that.
Well, and interjecting a small little point, when that happens, the bouquet of the whiskey fills the room. So if I
Mhm.
have multiple samples drying in my studio will carry the bouquet of that particular whiskey for at least a day or two. So it's a real sensory project.
Yeah, it's almost like the music that's playing in the background while you do your
Yeah,
photography.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, Ernie, this has been tremendous. I could bother you for a very long time, but how about we jump into a couple quick lightning round questions?
Perfect. Let's do it.
All right. Classic desert island scenario. And this might be
Yes.
difficult for you because your palate is fairly widely traveled, but let's assume that, we're a spirits and cocktail podcast. You can lop off the cocktail if you want, but the question is, if you could have one cocktail and one bottle to accompany you on a desert island for
Hmm.
the rest of your life, interpret that scenario however you want, what would
Sure.
they be?
Um, I'm not much of a cocktail person, but my wife is. And I'm assuming Desert Island, I'm going to have my wife on there. I'm not going to be
Sure. All right.
marooned alone.
Yeah, that's fair.
She has recently found The Last Word. Have you heard of
Ah,
that?
it's my favorite cocktail, of course.
She is in love with that cocktail. And so that's the cocktail that I would say for her. For me, I was gifted a bottle of the Balvenie Doublewood 25. Truly a stunning bottle.
Mhm.
Um, so it'd either be that one or the Balvenie 21 Portwood.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are very high on my list.
My father is a huge Balvenie fan as well, so I've had the chance to check those out. Um, yeah, I love the last word because you could also look at that as cheating of like, oh, those are four other bottles you get to take onto the island there. But it
Absolutely.
do you know what your wife's favorite gin is with the last word, or is she just started playing around with it?
She has tried several gins, but she always comes back to the Hendrix
Mm-hmm.
as a good mixing gin. Um, she plays around with the Esme. We've tried a couple other gins, but as far as a cocktail gin, she says nothing beats the Hendrix.
Well, if you ever get a chance,
Yes, absolutely.
I'd recommend, and this will hopefully resonate with you as a Scotch whiskey fan, but the Botanist is really, really lovely in both a last word format and also, your classic drier formats like your martini. The Botanist is very near and dear to my heart, and obviously also a product of our friends over at Recalibration.
Now, I don't know how much time we have, but I've got a botanist story.
Please.
She loves the botanist straight with a little bit of lemon. So
Mm.
the botanist is definitely not lost on us.
Oh yeah.
But for their face, uh, I'm probably going to say this wrong, but Face Isla Festival
Mm-hmm.
last year, they released a barrel aged botanist. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to at least contact. Well, at first I tried to get one, and they didn't ship to Arizona. So I'm like, oh, okay, I can't get that. So I'm never afraid to ask respectfully, um, can you provide me information or a sample? So I contacted Brooke Laddie and I said, hey, this is who I am. This is what I do. I've recently found out that barrel aged gin will create patterns like my Vanishing Spirits work. Would it be possible to get a small sample of the aged botanist? And they were so kind. They were able to get me after a couple months delay because it was in the height of the pandemic. They were able to get me a small sample, and it did not produce patterns like it normally would because it was aged entirely in a French wine cask,
Mm-hmm.
and the wine element really messes with the pattern.
It's
And
those damn
so
grapes.
it really is. And so I got some interesting images, but not quite what I was expecting.
Mm.
So anyway, wonderful tasting, very sugary botanist flavor to it. But that's my botanist story.
Awesome. I'm glad. I'm glad I didn't even realize they had released that version. So, next question here. What's a seemingly small or idiosyncratic occurrence that always makes your day? And as somebody who focuses in on the small and idiosyncratic, I'm hoping that you're sensitive to this sort of phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely. There are two things that pop to mind. Um, my drive from my home to work, it's a pretty peaceful drive. And so even though I'm going to kind of an intense environment, going to work at a hospital, um, it's always kind of a recalibration for the morning or the evening, just having that peaceful drive through the mountains, down the center of the city. That's a nice recalibration for me.
Mm.
Um, I also love to exercise. So at the end of a particularly stressful day, if I have a really good run, that's one of those nice things that I've really come to appreciate, especially as I'm getting older. Really good workouts are more difficult to achieve nowadays. Um, and so when I have a really good run, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love the notion of recalibration because as an artist, you're somebody who is constantly using your own senses and as an extension of and as a filter for what you're getting from your tools.
Sure.
And so that recalibration aspect, having a set point to return to seems to be really valuable. So
Absolutely.
that's really interesting answer. If you could have a cocktail with anybody in the world, past or present, who would it be? Where would you go? What would you enjoy? Just kind of paint us a picture.
Mm. Um, Probably have to be my grandfather. My grandfather was he died in '93, and I was just becoming an interesting adult by that time. He was a plumber by trade.
Hmm.
He lived up in a small town in Washington. Was Depression era, so when he was 21, 22, it was at the height of the Depression. And so he had migrated from South Dakota to Washington just looking for work, anything that he could pick up. And when he made it to Washington, um, the only place that was hiring full time was a plumbing practice. And so he picked up plumbing and created a very successful business in that particular town. But he was a whiskey drinker. And I had not gotten into whiskey or alcohol that much by the time he had passed. And so the fact that I had gotten into this, I hate to call it a line of work because it's a line of passion, really, but had grown my palate and have come to appreciate whiskey, knowing that he was someone that appreciated that, and just being able to talk to him would be awesome.
Yeah. It's funny, right before we sat down to record this interview, I had just repaired a bridge arm floor lamp that my grandfather and I had rewired together. Very similar
Mm,
story of like somebody, he came down from
yeah,
Canada,
yeah,
served in the US military during Reconstruction in France, and then came
okay.
back and was, ran a garage and a Christmas tree farm. It was just generally a handyman. And so, literally, this bridge arm floor lamp that
Oh
you see
wow,
right here,
oh that's beautiful.
he rewired it. He passed a couple of years back, but he rewired that with me, and I managed to break it because I'm not a gentle
Yeah,
person, and so I just in time for an interview, I was able to take it apart and make it so that it worked again. So really timely answer there. Um, Last question here.
yeah.
You're somebody who has a very good sample size when it comes to the spirits world, especially within a few verticals, right?
Mhm.
Scotch whiskey being one of your deepest. Do you have any controversial views or opinions in the spirits or
Oh,
cocktail world?
interesting. Um, the one that first jumps to mind is this battle between age statements and no age statements. Um, I get why the no age statements have become popular with distilleries because
Hmm.
you know whiskey can be tasty at a young age, um, and so taking some of that younger whiskey and turning it into something new or exciting, it's a great way to get some of that younger stock out of out of the storage units and into people's hands. But as a consumer, you kind of want to know what you're consuming, and I think distilleries have become better about telling what's in the bottle. Um, but yeah, that's one of the controversies. You probably are aware of this, but the whole raging blockchain sales of physical objects.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. I understand both sides. It's a new and interesting way to sell whiskey, to get people interested in the whiskey markets and get unique whiskeys into people's hands. Um, but it's also, is it environmentally friendly? Is it an efficient way to get something into people's hands? And it feeds into the secondary market of flipping bottles. Um,
Yeah.
we talked about this on the Whiskey Cast live presentation, and I'm someone that believes that whiskey should be drunk, should be shared, should be enjoyed. And granted, if you're buying a 70-year-old whiskey, or with the Macallan, an 81-year-old whiskey that just came on the market, um, you'd have to be really rich to be able to enjoy a $1 million whiskey. But for it to just sit there I don't know. There's something that's lost. The
Mhm.
people that crafted that 80 years ago, 81 years ago, um, did they want it to just sit on a shelf?
Well, I think that's a really great place to bring this interview to a close, because I think what it puts us in contact with is the fact that when we consume a spirit, we are consuming art, right? Like I ran
Totally
actually,
agree.
I'll share my screen just briefly one more time here. Um, and I'll pull up this graphic, but let me get to it here. Here it is. We shared a
Oh
poll
yeah, yeah.
out for our listeners this week, and it was sort of inspired by the fact that we're going to be talking with you. And so I asked, which is more important for whiskey making, art or science? And 72% of people answered science, and I think that's telling.
Absolutely.
I think that I think it's accurate.
Mhm.
You can't have the spirit unless you understand the science that's responsible for getting it to turn from a grain into a distillate. On the other hand, I do think that what we're drinking, when we crack open that bottle and pour it into the glass, and we consider the amber color that was yielded by what my friend Lou Bank and has shared with me from the agave world, that Mexican distillers call the 500 decisions,
Mhm.
right? The 500 decisions
Yeah,
that bring that from the grain to the glass. That really is art. And I think the questions that you're bringing up about NFTs and the blockchain world, I know that there's some projects that you're involved with there, and I think that
true.
there's a lot of there's a lot of legitimate use cases for that when it comes to sharing actual unique pieces of art. And
Yeah.
so in that respect, I think you're super well qualified to comment on that. But I do agree with you. There is sort of this lingering question, and maybe this is what we can leave up in the clouds for our listeners. Right. So what you're doing is, when you photograph these spirits, you're leaving a few drops of whiskey in the glass, and
Mhm.
and you're able to capture the process of those spirits vanishing.
Yeah.
But it seems to be a different type of vanishing when suddenly the spirits are being hoarded and not being drunk and enjoyed. Like, it's a vanishing of a more tragic type.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you're referring to, and in that respect, I completely agree. I think that the work that you're doing is really exciting. I'm excited to keep on following you and seeing what you produce. And if there's any way that I can be of assistance in that project, as somebody who just is enjoying the heck out of spectating from the sidelines, please do hit me up. And
Absolutely.
can you just share with our listeners how to follow you and how to connect with you in the digital space before we sign off here?
So I am on several social media sites. I'm on Instagram. I actually have two accounts, one for my whiskey work and one for my non-whiskey work. My whiskey work is Vanishing Spirits underscore Ernie Button. And my non-whiskey work is just straight up Ernie Button.
Mhm.
I am on Twitter. Um, I don't post a lot, but I'm on there. I do have a website. It's erniebutton.com. And there is a email on there that you can click and send me an email if you want. Um, yeah, those are the main ways to contact.
Awesome. Well, Ernie, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest here on the Modern Bar Cart podcast. Thank you for the work
Absolutely.
that you've done, and best of luck as you
Thanks.
continue this series of incredible experiments.
No, I appreciate it. It was wonderful to talk with you, Eric, and thanks for having me on.
Cheers.